personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a very special guest on the show, all the way from Copenhagen, Bianca Lopes. She is a fintech innovator, a mathematician, someone who's interested in identity. She is the co-founder of Talle. And she does a ton of different things. So you have a show, Be in the Know, your Be in the Know show. You and I had the pleasure of meeting. We collaborated on a panel together for the Open Banking World Congress in Spain. So that was fun for us to do together. We did something on kind of consent and banking and finance. And you're such an effervescent personality, and you're so knowledgeable in all these different spheres. So I would love for you to tell people about yourself, your journey, which I think is fascinating because you touch on all these different fun areas that I like to talk about as well in technology.
Debbie, thanks for inviting me here. Thanks everybody who's out there listening to this wonderful diva, but just like gem spark of a human in person. So I was excited because I remember writing the Did You Know post that I posted of you on my LinkedIn when I was kind of like creeping on you and the things you talk about. Well, I guess we'll start with where I was born and like where I spend most of my time. Like I grew up actually in Brazil, in Rio. And I think that gives you a little bit of perspective in life, just of inequality. So sort of had a chip on my shoulders of wanting to change the world. Thought I was going to be a diplomat, moved all the way to Canada, ended up studying economics and political science there. And quite quickly realized I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I was a swimmer at the time and spending a lot of time in the pool. And like, let's just say I had a really nice coach person that said to me, you're not going to really be an Olympia. You might want to do something else. So I found entrepreneurship through sort of a necessity of having to pay for international tuition. And I've had like the most strange businesses that got me to identity. I've started with like a painting and drywalling business. I've done like a B Corp certification company where we were like recycling up fabric and building sort of a sustainable business model before this was like cool, working in WWF. So I always had a side of me that cared about, the world and why we do business, why we create value. Funny enough, I've been a banker. So I've worked for RBC, I've worked in risk, I've worked in futures, I've worked in commercial banking. And I started my identity career kind of backwards, didn't really know what I was getting into. I started in the access control space. So for people out there, I was learning how SOC rooms operated and working with some of the largest data centers in North America. And at the time I was working with things like biometrics, which about a decade and a half ago were kind of weird and are kind of still a bit minority report. And it got me really interested in what was behind it. And not only from a privacy perspective, how the technology worked, who was behind it, who would have access to it. And, my job there was growing the company and turning the company to sell biometrics to banks, because that's all I knew. I knew the banking industry. So where do you start as an entrepreneur growing a company? You go to the people you know and you say, hey, what do you think about this thing? And quite quickly understood, the nuances of authentication, identification. And I think some of the things we laughed about last time we were together were around the fact that, the identity industry is a bit to blame for this. We make things super complicated. And a lot of what my journey brought me here today. I'm an investor. I'm still a builder. I back people that are building things. I've worked with the Gates Foundation and consulting for some of the largest identity projects around the world, just because I'm curious. And I've been trying to get to the bottom of like, how do these biometric systems work? What happens when, Russia and Visa were working to launch the DBS, which is a digital biometric system? What happened when, the Adar had a biometric system that was constitutional? What happened to privacy then? So I've always just been in these interesting projects out of just extreme curiosity to figure it out how can technology really change the world, and what can it really do? And yeah, that's a little bit about me, a lot about me, but I hope that's valuable context.
Yeah, that's great context, actually. I think when we talk about identity, and I just want your thoughts about this. So I spoke at an identity conference, I don't know, about 4 years ago. And, this is before COVID and everything. And they were very gracious to invite me as a privacy person into their space. So I work a lot with
They
identity people.
need all the privacy people there. We need to talk to each other and understand that the hack that we're building is actually all connected. But hey, that's another conversation.
It absolutely is. But I mean, the thing that I said there is like identity in the future is going to be like the center of everything. So we're seeing the shift away from kind of what corporations want to the rise of individual rights, and all that centers around, in my view, identity. And then for you being in kind of a finance or financial or banking space, understanding that intersection, it sort of puts you in the middle of everything, because I feel like a lot of these innovations, they come to the public from banking. I think banking kind of leads the way. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, lots to unpack there. About banking leading the way to innovation to the end consumer. I see what you mean in terms of value. I think that's been like dramatically changing in the sense of, I think a lot of the innovations, whether good or bad, came to consumers through phones as a means, as a channel, but a lot of obviously our connected, beloved internet and web 2. What I get excited about when I think about identity in this space and in this context, it is in the center of everything, not because it's just the new hottest trend. It's just foundational to building systems. And I think that's where a lot of us went wrong. And, it's kind of hard to, and that doesn't mean anonymity, and that doesn't also mean pseudonymity or knowing everything. I think this like notion of privacy and boundaries is a really interesting one when we start talking about plugging everything. When you connect everything, and everything now starts to have two-way communication and exchange of value, an exchange of data. You no longer have a one-way situation, which is what Web3 would allow some of these things to do. The notion of knowing who you're dealing with and the things that you have, and temporary custody, and some of these other nuances of consent become very important foundations for the infrastructure. So I do believe that maybe, I've been beating the drum for maybe 10 years, just actually 13 years around identity. And maybe now it's the center, but I think it will be for a while. Like a lot of these systems we've built, peripheries, because it's almost like we didn't expect these things to grow and to grow exponentially from a data perspective. So we build a lot of security around it. And now when you're like breaking things apart and creating new models of exchange, you're going to have to build new ways of conserving boundaries, new ways of identifying things and people and stuff and machines. And yeah, so it's cool. It's cool to see the change. Not fast enough though.
No, definitely not. One thing I love your thoughts about, and this is related to open banking. So I think we're having two things that are happening simultaneously. We have people who may be afraid to share, right? So they want to find ways to preserve their own data and their information. But then we also have these ecosystems with open banking where there are many different types of ways that people consume finance or financial products, and having banks around the world try to help facilitate that to kind of create less friction. So in one way, we're saying we want things more closed, right, in a way, but then also open. So how can we have it both ways?
That's where identity comes in.
Yeah.
We can have it both ways by defining, identity. We normally think of like in a KYC space, and we normally think of in a static thing or like an all or nothing. Like you have all my information and me. Identity is actually really just like the attribute that you can use in a contextual time. And just like all of us, we have many identities and many ways in which we interact with them. So that's how you can have it all. You can have a world where, if we really look at identity in the metaverse as an example as a primitive, or we look at it in the layer one protocols, which is like I'm a super advocate of. And I think a lot of what's happening in the market, you can point back to identity being not the savior of it all, but certainly a foundation to prevent some concentrations in the market that could have led us into different places. And I think you see that a lot in, soul-bound NFTs and Web5 talking about security, privacy, and identity. I think some people see the writing on the wall of this necessity. Where I think it's interesting from an open banking and open data perspective is, the consumer will care when they can realize the true value of the connectivity of our lives. Like when people talk about, knowing that I care about sustainability and I also care about CBDC, it creates a Venn diagram that you can sell to me, right? It's been talked about it for years in the ad duopoly. When now this becomes something I can participate in, and maybe through a Plaid, or maybe through a value exchange of True Layer, or maybe through my bank, that is the true value add of the people I will allow to be the discretionary manager of my data, which I think it's kind of like an interesting concept of custody, which I think is where the future of open data really leads us, is like, where's the cheapest cost to settle on this transaction? That's why I want to use this. I want to see the benefit on the end of consumers and, wealth more equally distributed. And I think that's what gets me super excited.
What do you think about getting people into identity systems? So we know for those who are, very connected, like us in technology, we don't have problems getting into identity systems. But I think a lot of these innovations can't reach everyone because we're having trouble getting people in identity systems. So tell me a little bit about that problem, a problem of access, problem of having people in systems where they can actually take advantage of all these innovations.
So the problem with people not having access, or people just information being vulnerable, which one do you want to tackle first?
We'll say people.
There's aspects to that question.
There are. Let's talk about just getting people into systems and then talk about the vulnerability after.
Cool. So getting people into systems, well, we suck. We suck because the incentive structures actually don't suck. They're quite correct. When you look at the people making money in identity, it's in the hands of a few. And so it's even the way we make money on KYC and the way we make money on data duplication, it's kind of just archaic. And there's lots that I think that can change with some of the SSI principles that technically come to bear. We've excluded about 2 billion people still, or undermined it. You look at Adar as an example, there's entire birthing naming agencies that have put, entire generations to be birthed on the same day, on the same time, and, have ignored the fact that people are actually born in different times because the infrastructure is just not there to support it. And there's just no lack of, public commitment to people's, the importance of perhaps what a credential effectively carries. What gets interesting and exciting on the technology side, not only from a biometric perspective or from other technologies, is this ability of enabling people to prove something fundamentally they can prove if they were standing in front of your face, is that they are here and they do exist, and that they are Bianca or whatever, whomever they claim they are, and they can start adding attributes. So, the barrier of inclusion goes down from a technological perspective because it enables something for us humans to do that we can do if we were all living in a small village, which I think is a fundamental right to own who you are. And I think some of these technologies start to scratch the surface of what, human rights sort of adherence could look like in a technological space.
Excellent. I would love your thoughts on privacy and how privacy sort of sneaks in. So I think traditionally when people were building these digital systems, they were very focused on cybersecurity. So let's gather all this information and put it behind some wall and protect it that way, right? But then what we see is globally there are more individuals are gaining more rights. So organizations need
Climbing back.
to, right, exactly. So organizations are really needing to rethink that whole, well, let's just build a wall around it, but you still have obligations that you're continuing to have as a result of all these new laws and regulations around privacy. So tell me how privacy kind of snuck in here and what are your thoughts here?
I think snuck in here, not fast enough and not loud enough. I think is seen as a compliance exercise versus an exercise of boundaries and an exercise of value creation. Because I think that's the future of that's actually the foundation of any healthy relationship. If you kind of think about it, when you think about it from a bank or a digital service provider, you often forget how much am I giving for how much am I getting kind of rule that this allows you to do. Privacy allowed you to say, to talk about those boundaries and sometimes it's really great to have regulation because it forces, as you said, corporations to understand the liability that they have, the compliance exercise they need to do. What I think it's often not there yet is seen as an opportunity of change and an opportunity to engage that relationship and regain more trust. So I think privacy sneaks in, not fast enough and loud enough, but it sneaks in like in an interesting way that the ones who have seen the opportunity in the light understand that, hey, this is a chance for me to build better systems, for me to look at partners, for me to look at transparency in my UX and conversation, and for me to also understand where the boundaries of my ethical business, value creation really resides.
Yeah, I agree with that. I love that you pose it as a healthy relationship. I think that's like a great analogy because what we see, what I see the future companies struggling with, if you can't build a relationship with someone, you're going to have kind of less data and less accurate data. Also, you've written something on your LinkedIn about privacy and trust and about, having, for example, providing a secret to someone that you expect them to, keep your confidence, right? And when they betray that, that is a betrayal of trust. And so how much do you want to share with these folks? So I think it goes back to relationship. What are your thoughts?
I think it totally goes back to relationships. I think it's back to human principle fundamentals of we've heard banks or some large institutions talk about trust. We also seen it erode in their share value. Or their ability to attract talent, which then eventually would erode in their share value or their market share growth. Sure, banks right now will make some money because of interest spreads, but neither here nor there. I think it's like a long-term commitment to understanding where you stand and kind of what you're really good at. Like, why am I here as an organization? Like, I think, sometimes consultants or freelancers are faced with that question on a daily grind. What value do you bring? Sometimes organizations, when they're well established, tend to forget. And I think that's what bringing it back to trust in this relationship of a secret or betrayal. It's, and I think you're starting to see a lot of technology changes to saying transparency, accountability, the blockchain principles are around that. So when that happens and people start to realize, wait a minute, part of my data sets are being sold by some of these financial institutions for years, even though and I didn't get a penny and I have to pay to keep my stuff. Like, wait a minute, right? Like, it's just, we haven't made it that obvious and that clear to people to question. And yeah, we're all super busy or zombied out. I don't know which one of the two. But I think time for that accountability and conversation, I hope, is coming. And I think brands better listen to the crazy people on this podcast.
Absolutely. I think that there's an asymmetrical relationship right now between what the value that people give versus the value that they get. So I think having those levels of transparency may help right the ship to some extent, at least make it less asymmetrical so that people can really see the true value. And, I tell companies, if an individual trusts you, they'll give you better data, right? They'll give you more data because they trust you with it. So I think it's only a benefit to those organizations. What's happening in the world right now that's concerning you the most around either identity, privacy, personally or professionally?
What's happening in the world in privacy and identity? Well, what's not happening? We're still not agreeing. We're still not getting to a conversation about our standards interoperating. You look at EIDAS in Europe and, what's happened with like the Belgium announcement and conversation about having monopolies in a business that needs much change. And I talked to you about, how do we build a foundation and the primitives for identity for all these new things we want to build? We have an opportunity to rebuild, the metaverse or, values of storage like NFTs. And we're here talking about monopolies and not public and private partnerships and not academic discovery and not enough R&D. So that concerns the hell out of me because I still see a room full of egos and a not willingness to, just maybe not be the smartest person in the room for once and build another acronym because we're a small industry, identity, privacy, even though we're massive and, some of the fines or some of the deals in software in both of our industries are ginormous and considerable. That scares me. So I guess it's our lack of playing nice in the sandbox together as human beings. That scares the crap out of me. Right. And it also scares me that we're not using it for things like the horrendous things that are happening in the world. So I often say to people, I've been I'm starting up a fund around sustainability and identity, and I'm doing lots of interesting things around understanding how does this technology work for us to get anywhere in our goals. Like, how do we get to any 2030 goals as an example using things like where is privacy used to hide information in today's, binary construct? Where is it used for good? And how do we kind of accelerate those things? So that concerns me. Those unconnected conversations concern me because I don't know, I still see a world suffering and on fire. So
somehow, some way, I feel like we need to, in order to right the ship, we have to bring back the idea that whatever we do with data or technology has to, at its core, benefit the individual. So right now we see things that benefit corporations, they benefit, like you say, the egos in the room, but they don't really benefit individuals. So I'm looking forward to a time where, that is not like a nice to have, it's not like we do these.
Oh, that's cute.
Yeah, that's cute, right?
That's nice. Oh, that's nice. And I'm like, and you do what?
Right. Where it has to be something.
And you build this for what?
Yeah, it's an economic imperative. Right now, we just have kind of this underbelly, multi-billion-dollar industry, especially in data brokering, where it doesn't really benefit the individual and people don't know what they're doing. So finding ways to bring transparency to that and make it sort of not valuable to be able to do that in some ways. So that's why I think it's one of our biggest challenges. What are your thoughts?
I say, where do I sign and start helping for that to be transparent? And how to make people care, right? How do we make the people outside of listening to this wonderful community in your Data Diva podcast care? I think it has to hit home that this is a value. If you just go back to the basics of, everybody can understand time. To a certain extent, everybody can understand the notion of time. And the notion of, their contribution. Oh, wait a minute, I do spend 3 hours on TikTok or Facebook or Instagram or Google or whatever. I do create value in some ways, in some business models. I don't help the planet. I don't do this. Can you create incentive? That's where I get really excited about Web3. It's can you create incentive structures, not use human feelings and emotions for doing good, for creating something that fosters art, culture, sports, intelligence, kindness, the environment, caring. So I get very excited about trying to fix that, to be optimistic on that side. And I think you're totally right. We need to do it.
Yeah. One thing I end up working on in addition is biometrics. And I don't know about you, I get frightened a lot of times when I see some of the things people are trying to do in biometrics. And that's one reason why I like to, play in that space, because I feel like you can't just complain and be upset about it. You have to do something. So you want to be in the room when people are having these wacky conversations and trying to do these
Yeah, when they're talking
crazy
about
things.
dominating the world and yeah.
Right. Where do you think we're going with biometrics, especially, as I see people in finance, they're kind of leading in this space in terms of how people um, uh, interact with biometrics. A lot of it ends up, in my view, starting in finance.
Yeah. So the question is like, where do I see this going for biometric space, people, or the finance industry in general?
Well, I think the finance industry in general, but then also from a people perspective.
I think people are used to it. I think people are, they've been trained. That's what Apple does really well since they bought Acuity, which is like the fingerprint reader, the first biometric that went into the phone. And when you look at what the finance industry is trying to do, they're still thinking of biometrics for the most part around as a KYC tool, so as an attribute. So as an identification, very few, but as an authentication mechanism more than anything else, which I think it still shows how inventive they are in some of the application. Like when you look at some countries, honestly, like Brazil, that have been playing with biometrics since, I don't know, 2003. Actually, in the late 90s, some of the banks like Itaú had invested heavily in ATMs. And that's why the public got so comfortable so fast. I expect us to see a conversation. I hope we have a conversation about privacy again. This feels like about 10 years ago with some of the new, you're starting to see palm veins again with young entrepreneurs into the market. You're starting to see some of the facial recognition companies going into like credentials for travel, credentials for health, which concern me on a few levels of, one of them we can talk about very simple is like data storage, right? There's a massive amount of centralized databases of biometrics everywhere around the world. So as an investor, I'm constantly looking at companies that are, doing something to change this, like an Onabit as an example. Like how these are vulnerabilities that it's great to have the technology, has incredible potential, is often applied very simplistically, not to the full foundational value of identity or an attribute. It seldomly has cryptographic capacities or components like zero knowledge proofs that are the best, because unfortunately this business is still very polluted with a lot of vendors and a lot of noise. So you see a lot of banks sometimes and financial institutions implementing things and creating actually, they want to store things in their own cloud. So they create actually like liabilities for themselves without really thinking it all the way through, even though the consumer is used to it. It is a better onboarding experience. Yes, perhaps is easier. And it's definitely more secure than a traditional password. And we all are well aware of that already.
Yeah, I think that that's true. So I think when people try to implement these new toys, sometimes they don't think about the added risk that they're bringing into their organization. So they have to be more, get more wise about what they're doing. Companies that want to implement like biometrics in applications, they're definitely creating more risk for themselves, especially around the retention of that data. So the capture and the retention, that's kind of an issue. But I think people forget once they do the capture, they want to keep everything forever, which creates a huge risk. So I tell companies, when you have data that has like a low business value, it has a high data privacy and cyber risk. So being able to sort of understand what that cutoff is, and it isn't as easy as saying, oh, delete this every, 7 years or whatever. It's like once someone's proved their identity, you have to really think as an organization, how long do we need to keep this information? So I think that's a huge area of risk that I think almost any company has. And I think that things need to change in terms of the way companies think about that risk, because it's huge. What are your thoughts?
I think you're totally right. What I don't like to go into is just that, yes, because it's more risk, then don't use it at all, because we then often don't compare to the existing risk we have with Asian systems or passwords or some of these other things. It's actually take the step into the right direction of foundational transformation and change, but understand the foundations of the technology and understand, as you said, the long-term consequences of your architecture decisions or your vendor supplier relationships, which lead into, okay, do I have dependency? Do I have duplications? Like how many points of vulnerability? And I think invest in that knowledge and that understanding, and don't think you can do it yourself, because a lot of these, even if you look at biometrics, like it's kind of like a bit arrogant when some of these banks say, I'm going to build the best voice system in the world or the best finger voice. Like some of these things are entire businesses and like entire, massive amounts of data and dedication and algorithm and mathematical excellence and cryptographic excellence. So it's like, even then understand, what are your then points of failure as an organization? Do you need to you can leverage services? Like that's why Web3 and some of these things that are more decentralized or understand the value of co-creating almost the magic formula to get to the value for the client instead of and I know that requires, massive regulatory conversations and changes that we need to do as an industry collectively, but I hope to see a lot of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we were the world according to Bianca and we did everything that you said, what would be your wish for privacy or identity anywhere around
the world doesn't exist, because the world shouldn't be anywhere that one person can do everything. The world, like, please don't put me in that world. Sorry. What was the end of the question?
Oh, I said, so if it were the world according to Bianca and we did everything that you said, what would be your wish for identity or privacy or open finance, open banking?
My wish is for human freedom and equality. And for us to realize that a lot of us got trapped in some perception and some construct that we were told was the right way to go, whether that is as philosophical as it sounds or as basic as, why does KYC have to continue to be the way it is? Why have privacy laws, some of them not evolved in 20 years? So I think what I wish for is for us to accept sort of what is, take account of that in a very open, sort of unlearning, worthy conversation, and build better from there. And the world's definitely not somewhere that I get to tell the rules. That is not my ideal world. Anybody for that matter.
Yes. Well, we have to unlearn some bad habits and we have to relearn new things to be able to move forward in the world in a way that benefits organizations, but also doesn't harm individuals.
Or maybe in a way that benefits humanity and the planet, and then we can figure it out what kind of organizations we need to have to keep everybody well. I sound utopian, but that's what one is born to do.
That's right. Exactly. You have to strive for something. So it's great. It's great. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. You've been, you're such a shining star and a great advocate for humans and technology. That's why we get along so well. And thank you for being on the show. This is fantastic.
Thank you for having me, Debbie. You're a light. And then just keep doing what you're doing. We need to scream and shout, or actually maybe not scream and shout, just dance and tell people, hey, come be over here. We bloom over here. There's change over here. So keep doing what you're doing. And thanks for talking to me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Bye, dear.